Do you know who is the most hated British person in the Middle East? From a recent perspective, you might say Tony Blair or Winston Churchill. However, what if you were told that there's another man so deeply hated by Arabs that he is known as the root cause of all evil in the Middle East? In the Arab world, this man's reputation is so deeply covered in blood that his name is synonymous with a century of conflict between Arabs and Israelis. Meet Lord James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary who promised the creation of a Jewish homeland centered in the heart of the Arab world. With this promise, James Balfour and the British Crown laid the seeds that would grow into a hellish garden of devastating conflicts which claimed, and are still claiming, hundreds of thousands of lives. This is the historiographer, and in this video, we will explore how the British government ruined the Middle East for decades, with the infamous Balfour Declaration. We began our story in 1882 with the first massive wave of Zionist-sponsored Jewish immigration to Palestine, which had been under Ottoman control for more than 3 centuries. In response to this first wave, the Ottoman government began restricting Jewish immigration. However, despite indignations from the local Arabs, the Sublime Porte allowed wealthy Jews to buy land in northern Palestine in 1901, increasing their population from 3% to 7% by 1914. By 1914, the distrust of the supremacist Ottoman Young Turks government, as well as the second wave of Jewish immigration, fueled Arab and Palestinian nationalism, with anti-Zionism becoming a unifying force. The First World War began in July of 1914. Involving the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia against the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary, where the Ottomans were initially neutral. Yet, when Ottoman leader Enver Pasha decided to attack Russia in the Black Sea raid on the 29th of October 1914, he involved the Ottoman Empire in the war against Russia's allies, the British Empire and France. In response, the British cabinet first discussed Palestine on November 9th, 1914, and from here, the British would begin handing out territorial promises to anybody and everybody. Firstly, by December 1914, Herbert Samuel, a British cabinet member, met with Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann. The result of the meeting was a widely circulated memorandum advocating for Palestine's annexation into the British Empire with the promise of Jewish colonies, which was the first official proposal to enlist Jewish support as a war measure. Secondly, by the end of 1915, the British High Commissioner Henry McMahon exchanged letters with Al-Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, promising Arab independence in a vast kingdom in exchange for a rebellion against the Ottomans. The promised Arab kingdom strategically excluded areas west of Damascus, while the exact boundaries, especially regarding Palestine, were left deliberately contentious. The Sharif had enough of the Turks anyways, and he didn't need much convincing to revolt. Thirdly, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of early 1916, negotiated by British and French diplomats Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot, proposed dividing Arab lands into British and French zones, with Palestine as an international mandate, in a total disregard to the agreement made with the Sharif. Fourthly, and despite the previous 2 promises made with the Sharif and the French, Sykes engaged with Zionist leaders, suggesting future Jewish colonization in Palestine under British protection. Perhaps the greatest catalyst to the emergence of the Balfour Declaration was the political shift in 1916 in London, when Prime Minister Lloyd George and his cabinet replaced the cabinet of the previous Prime Minister, Asquith, by the end of 1916. While both prime ministers were liberals leading wartime coalitions, Lloyd George and his foreign secretary, James Balfour, were with the idea of partitioning the Ottoman Empire after the war, unlike the previous Prime Minister Asquith, who wisely preferred its reform. With a change in government, Sykes was promoted to the War Cabinet Secretariat, handling Middle Eastern affairs. By January, he sought to meet other Zionist leaders and was introduced to Chaim Weizmann and Nahum Sokolov, 2 leading Zionists. In early 1917, Sykes began discussions with the Zionist leadership, emphasizing British support for Jewish control in Palestine, despite the previous British correspondence with the Arabs and the French. By the end of 1917, British troops had captured Jerusalem. Yet, the wider war had reached a stalemate, and on the Western Front, the tide was even turning in favor of the Central Powers. In this frantic environment, and to garner maximal Zionist support for the war effort, Britain's then Foreign Secretary, James Balfour, addressed Walter Rothschild, a figurehead of the British Zionist lobby, by saying, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation." With the failed German Spring Offensive in 1918, the First World War turned in favor of the Allies. As such, the victorious British and French empires hence formed a mandate system in the Middle East, mostly based on the previously agreed upon Sykes-Picot Agreement. The declared aim of the mandate system was to allow the winners of the war to administer the newly emerging states until they could become fully independent. The case of Palestine, however, was unique. Unlike the rest of the post-war mandates, the main goal of the British mandate there was to create conditions suitable for the establishment of a Jewish national home, despite the fact that Jews constituted less than 10% of the population in 1918. While the British Empire is generally held responsible for the Balfour Declaration, it is important to note that the statement wouldn't have been made without prior approval from other Allied powers during the First World War. According to the British Cabinet's meetings on October 4, 1917, the ministers recalled James Balfour, confirming that Woodrow Wilson, the American president, was extremely favorable to the movement. France was also involved and announced its support prior to the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. A May 1917 letter from Jules Cambon, a French diplomat, to Nahum Sokolov, a Polish Zionist, expressed the sympathetic views of the French government towards Jewish colonization in Palestine. It would be a deed of justice and reparation to assist by the protection of the Allied powers in the renaissance of the Jewish nationality in that land from which the people of Israel were exiled so many centuries ago, stated the French letter. Upon the start of the mandate, the British began to facilitate the immigration of European Jews to Palestine. Between 1922 and 1935, the Jewish population rose from 9% to nearly 27% of the total population. Though the Balfour Declaration included the caveat that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, the British mandate was set up in such a way to equip the Zionist movement with the tools for future self-rule at the expense of the Palestinian Arabs. On this soon-to-be-ignored caveat, the esteemed Jewish professor, Dr. Norman Finkelstein, said, "In the grand scheme of things, to the British Crown, Jews were more important than Arabs, but Balfour at least possessed the lucidity of mind to recognize the present inhabitants in Palestine." The Balfour Declaration was, and still is, controversial for many reasons. Firstly, the Balfour Declaration was, as Palestinian-American academic Edward Said described, made by a European power about a non-European territory in a flat disregard of both the presence and wishes of the native majority in that land. The prominent Jewish intellectual Arthur Koestler also called it one of the most improbable political documents of all time, in which one nation solemnly promised to a second nation the country of a third. Essentially, the British Foreign Secretary James Balfour promised the Zionist project a land where the native Arab population made up more than 90%. Secondly, the declaration was one of three conflicting wartime promises made by the British. At its release, Britain had already promised the Arabs independence from the Ottoman Empire through the 1915 Hussein-McMahon correspondence. Further, the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement with the French stated that most of Palestine would be under international administration, with the rest of the region divided between the two colonial powers after the war. The declaration, however, indicated that Palestine would come under British occupation, denying Palestinian Arabs independence. Finally, the declaration introduced an unprecedented notion in international law, that of a national home. The use of the ambiguous term national home for the Jewish people instead of national state left its meaning open to interpretation. The reasons behind the issuance of the Balfour Declaration have been debated for decades, with historians proposing various explanations based on different sources. Some argue that many in the British government were Zionists, while others suggest that the declaration was issued with an anti-Semitic motive, aiming to solve the Jewish problem by giving Palestine to the Jews. There is a general consensus in mainstream academia on a set of reasons. These include: 1. Control over Palestine was seen as a strategic imperial interest to keep Egypt and the Suez Canal within Britain's sphere of influence. 2. The British Empire sought to side with the Zionists to gain support amongst Jews in the United States and Russia, hoping they could encourage their governments to stay in the war until victory. 3. The intense Zionist lobbying and strong connections between the Zionist community in Britain and the British government, where some officials in the government were indeed Zionists themselves. The reactions concerning this declaration were angry from the start. For example, in 1919, the then US President Woodrow Wilson appointed a commission to look into the public opinion on the mandatory system in Syria and Palestine. The investigation was known as the King Crane Commission. It found that the majority of Palestinians, be it Palestinian Muslims, Christians, or Jews, expressed a strong opposition to Zionism, leading the conductors of the commission to advise a modification of the mandate's goal. The Palestinian political figure and nationalist Aoun Abdel Hadi condemned the Balfour Declaration in his memoirs, famously, or rather infamously, saying, "The Balfour Promise was made by an English foreigner who had no claim to Palestine to a foreign Jew who had no right to it," or in Arabic, وعد من لا يملك لمن لا يستحق. Even prior to the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate, Pan-Arab newspapers warned against the motives of the Zionist movement and its potential outcomes in displacing Palestinians from their land. Palestinian Christian Khalil as-Sakakini, a historian and teacher, described Palestine in the immediate aftermath of the war as follows: "A nation which has long been in the depth of sleep only awakes if it is rudely shaken by events." This was the situation in Palestine, which for many centuries has been asleep until it was shaken by the Great War, shocked by the Zionist movement, and violated by the illegal policy of the British Empire. The increased Jewish immigration under the Mandate created tensions between the Palestinian Arabs and European Jews. More significantly, the British allowed the Jews to establish self-governing institutions, such as the Jewish Agency, to prepare for statehood, while the Palestinians were forbidden from doing so. One of the first responses to the British actions was the Nabi Musa revolt in 1920, as well as the Great Arab Revolt in 1936. When the British decided to end their mandate in 1947 and transfer the question of Palestine to the United Nations, an act which many historians attribute to the King David Hotel bombing by the Zionist terrorist groups, such as the Irgun in 1946, the Zionist movement already had a well-formed army, an army which was even capable of taking the British troops head-on. This set the stage for the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine. As such, the Balfour Declaration is widely regarded as the precursor to the 1948 Palestinian Nakba, when Zionist armed groups forcibly expelled more than 750,000 Palestinians from their homeland. However, that is a story for another video. If you like this video, then consider subscribing to spread history. This has been the Historiographer, and for now, see you in the next video.